including life sentences.
They had a stretch where things were exceptionally violent inside. At that time, Atlanta had the reputation as being the most dangerous in the federal system because of the number of homicides, stabbings, etc.
Fear. If you can put the fear of God in someone, they'll stay away from you. As big as I was, no one dared jump on me because they'd seen me whip a couple guys pretty bad. And so that was pretty much the element that kept me alive.
Built in the grand scale of a classical cathedral, its gray stone facade rises 60 feet from the ground. A massive entranceway is dwarfed between imposing Grecian pillars. Known as the Big A to its inmates, Atlanta has held a diverse population from bootleggers to bank robbers to the prisoner who ran for president while still behind bars. From counterfeiters to legendary gangsters like Vito Genovese, Joe Valachi, and Al Capone. From cold-blooded killers to the warden who was sentenced to do time in his own prison. The story of Atlanta Federal Penitentiary begins in the 1870s when the federal government had less than 1,500 federal inmates and paid state facilities to house them. But by 1880, the number of federal offenders was growing and state prisons were becoming overcrowded. Clearly, the government needed its own prisons. So, in 1891, Congress passed the Three Prisons Act. The bill called for the creation of a federal prison in the East, the Midwest, and the West. Leavenworth in Kansas was the first built. Attorney General John Griggs had the task of choosing a site for the next prison. He settled on a 300-acre parcel just 1 mile from the city of Atlanta. It was on a principal street that was simply named Boulevard and was convenient to the railroads. To ensure the building of the prison and the jobs it would bring, the city of Atlanta purchased the land for $60,000 and donated it to the federal government. Plans were drawn by the same architects that had been responsible for the imposing structure of Leavenworth. Initial designs for the new prison called for 2 cell houses on either side of a grand entrance that would serve as part of the outer wall. It was also intended to make a psychological statement.
The physical structure of the building was meant to make a person entering it feel very small and insignificant. And most other institutions being built at this time, including mental institutions, juvenile reformatories, all were built along the same kind of grand scale.
Construction got underway in 1900 using convict laborers housed in temporary quarters. They had no experience in stone cutting.
There was a gentleman named Mr. Crawford who was a stonemason who trained the inmates in the construction of the building. Mr. Crawford used only inmates serving life sentences because of the amount of time that it took to train the inmates to do this kind of work.
The granite for the prison was quarried at Stone Mountain near Atlanta. It was considered some of the finest stone in the world and was used to build the locks of the Panama Canal, the gold repository at Fort Knox, the United States Treasury, and the Cuban capital in Havana. In 1902, the first cell houses were completed and 347 prisoners were in residence. Inmate number 19 was John M. Ross. He died in the prison while serving a life sentence for murder. Number 22 was Samuel Moon. He was also serving a life sentence for murder. Alfred Cheney, inmate number 31, had been transferred from Sing Sing to finish a 10-year sentence for robbing a post office. For the first prisoners at Atlanta, conditions were harsh. They wore striped uniforms and their hair was cropped short to make them easily identifiable should they attempt escape. Troublemakers were struck with billy clubs or handcuffed to their cell bars for days at a time. This was the dark side of a 19th century penal tradition called the Auburn system.
The philosophy behind that system was that it was important that inmates be separated from the outside community and each other, that they be made to be obedient, so they could follow authority, and that they be put to work, that there would be labor involved.
In 1903, the prisoners were put to work constructing the outer wall. Every morning for 7 years, Atlanta's convicts were marched out to pour concrete and set granite into the structure. When completed in 1910, it was 39 feet high, 4 feet thick, and more than 4,000 feet long. The gleaming white wall enclosed 27 acres and was the largest cement masonry project in America at the time. It contained 5,000 tons of concrete and 25,000 tons of granite. More than a deterrent to escape attempts, the wall reinforced Warden William Moyer's doctrine of complete isolation. He believed that the best results would be obtained if the prisoners knew nothing of what goes on outside the walls, and that the public should know nothing of what goes on inside. The inmates received no visitors and were allowed to write just one letter per month. They were not permitted to speak with others except for brief conversations in low tones. The dining room was also kept silent. Inmates sat at desk-like tables and could communicate to guards and staff using only approved signals and gestures. Prisoners were expected to hold their right hand up for bread, their fork up for meat, their spoon for soup, and their knife for vegetables. Church attendance was compulsory as part of the prison's policy of penitence and redemption, but there was little other activity inside. There were no prison industries, and inmates not selected to work on the wall and later building projects were left alone in their cells. These offered grim comfort at best. There was no hot water. A bucket served as the toilet. The men slept on beds made of iron slats covered with straw mattresses. With the completion of the first buildings here, the federal government had congratulated itself on the creation of a model prison. But for the growing number of federal prisoners inside, the giant stone edifice with its policy of forced silence and isolation became a monument to misery. In the early 1900s, convicts inside Atlanta Federal Penitentiary were isolated from the so-called corruptions of the outside world. It was a harsh and monotonous existence, but scholars of the day believed that penitence and rehabilitation could be accomplished here.
During the period when the prison was being constructed, it meant heavy manual labor most of the day with frugal amounts of food and not a great variety of food being provided for the inmates. And so there was just nothing to look forward to and nothing to look back to either.
Atlanta's prison guards also worked under severe conditions. They were paid $70 a month and worked 12-hour watches 7 days a week. By the time the prison was fully staffed, it had become a destination for sightseers. Early visitors were struck by what they called the prison's cavernous austerity, but the number of tourists soon became a problem.
In 1906, which was a few years after it was opened, there were several thousand visitors that came to the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary to see it and view it. And the warden got to the point where he said, we cannot allow this traffic of individuals in.
In keeping with his belief in isolation, Warden Moyer recommended that the bi-weekly tours be reduced to once a month. By 1909, he abolished them altogether, supposedly because of the dangers associated with a new phase of construction. An administration building and additional cell blocks were about to double the prison's capacity to nearly 1,200. 1912 brought an easing of conditions for Atlanta's prisoners. While Warden Moyer maintained a keen belief in economy, discipline, and education, he also began to implement a more progressive agenda. Light blue clothing replaced the original striped uniforms, and a new activity was introduced: baseball. The warden felt the sport was effective in improving discipline and introduced a baseball season to the prison that lasted 10 months. Prisoners were permitted to bring their cell chairs, musical instruments, and tobacco out to the ball field. During games, they were allowed to talk and cheer the players as long as they refrained from using profanity. The worst punishment was solitary confinement for 6 days and a loss of baseball privileges. Also in 1912, inmates began publishing a 4-page newspaper called Good Words. In 1938, the paper changed its name to The Atlantean and remains in print today. In the dining room, a prison orchestra played music during meals, and the desk-like tables that once filled the hall were replaced by standard furniture that seated 8. The warden also began to allow entertainment in from outside the wall. In 1913, the greatest Italian tenor of all time, Enrico Caruso, was welcomed to the prison chapel to give a concert on behalf of the Italian inmates. The prison newspaper reported Caruso sang with great feeling and extraordinary power. Also that year, prisoners were treated to a recital by John Philip Sousa and his band. The warden's log recorded every man in the penitentiary was present for a program that included El Capitan and the Washington Post March. Outside the wall, political turmoil was brewing. The Socialist Party of America had come to prominence with a platform of economic justice for the working class. Union leader Eugene Debs had marched with Susan B. Anthony for women's rights in 1880 and had campaigned for workers' rights ever since. Debs later became spokesman and standard-bearer for the socialist movement. An outspoken opponent of the U.S. entry into World War I, Debs' speeches were considered subversive by the government. Convicted in 1918 under the Federal Espionage Act, he was stripped of his citizenship and sentenced to 10 years at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. But Debs was undeterred by the prison sentence and not forgotten by his party during the 1920 presidential race.
Eugene Debs was the Socialist Workers' Party candidate for president, and he ran his campaign from inside the walls.
When the election returns were counted, Eugene Debs had won nearly 1 million votes, or about 3.5% of the total. Although he was soundly defeated in the election by the Republican Warren G. Harding, Debs had become a celebrity.
Anytime you have a prisoner running who makes significant gains in any kind of campaign, especially for president, it's going to draw a lot of attention. And this one was no different. I can't think of anything comparable.
On Christmas Eve, 1921, the prison received word that President Harding had commuted Debs' sentence. He was released on Christmas Day to a hero's welcome after 2 years behind bars. 5 years later, Debs died at the age of 71. During the 1920s, new federal laws caused Atlanta's inmate population to soar. These included the Volstead Act, prohibiting the sale of alcohol, the Harrison Narcotics Act, and the Dyer Automobile Theft Act. William Colbeck came to Atlanta with an 8th grade education and a conviction for assault and robbing the U.S. mail. For 25 years, he was prisoner number 22216. His partner, Gustav Dietmeier, was assigned the next number and was also in for 25 years. By 1923, Atlanta's population reached 2,800. This was more than twice its intended capacity. Inmates were forced to sleep 3 and 4 to a cell. At least 500 slept in hallways and basements. Enforcement of Atlanta's silence system became impossible, and it was abandoned. During this time, the warden, Albert E. Sartain, supervised the addition of a new power plant and water pumping facility. As the population and infrastructure at the penitentiary grew, so did the city around it.
2 years before construction of this facility, Atlanta had a population only of about 100,000. So this was a real boon to the economy of Atlanta. The city's population between 1900 and 1930 increased to about 400,000. And so in the 20s, the economy of the city was going very well.
This was the Roaring Twenties, and just over a mile from the prison, the city offered a wealth of temptations.
What you would have had was the southern equivalent of the Great White Way, say on Broadway in New York. There would have been neon signs of the movie theaters along Peachtree Street, the restaurant, the movie, the shopping district.
Not to mention speakeasies, brothels, and gambling houses. Soon, an FBI investigation discovered that, for a price, Warden Sartain was allowing inmates to partake in Atlanta's nightlife.
He was releasing inmates to be able to go into the city of Atlanta, into the hotels, and throw parties and have entertainment. So he was accepting bribes from the inmates.
Decades later, Jack Hanbury was warden of Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. He knows that bribery is an ongoing problem in the prison system.
If a person is greedy and wants to get involved in accepting a bribe, they're going to get involved. The inmates know who to bribe or attempt to bribe and who not to. A con can spot a con. They're a good judge of that.
In February of 1927, Warden Albert Sartain was convicted and sentenced to 1.5 years on federal charges of conspiracy to accept a bribe. He had his mugshot taken by an inmate photographer. He was fingerprinted. He was issued a prison uniform and led to a cell inside his own prison. During the 1930s, the administration of Atlanta Federal Penitentiary focused on individual rights. Warden Joseph Sanford granted inmates open access to library shelves and encouraged them to teach and attend school in prison classrooms. Building on the prison's tradition of baseball, other sporting events and track tournaments were added to the inmates' program. To show their gratitude, the inmates dedicated the athletic field to James Bennett, director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. From then on, the grassy area was designated Bennett Field. The 1930s was also the era of the gangster. And in 1932, Atlanta Federal Penitentiary received its most notorious offender. Alphonse Capone was the most famous of all American mobsters. His domination of Chicago's bootleg liquor traffic and gambling enterprises brought him an illegal income of more than $20 million a year by the end of the 1920s. As brutal as he was ingenious, Capone survived the Chicago gang wars by killing his competitors one by one. His thirst for blood and power culminated in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, in which he ordered the execution-style murder of 7 members of a rival gang. The only witness left alive was a dog. Unable to connect Capone directly to his career as a mob boss and murderer, the Chicago police were powerless to bring about a conviction. Meanwhile, Capone enjoyed a flamboyant, high-profile lifestyle as a socialite and national celebrity. Finally, federal authorities succeeded where the Chicago police could not. In October 1931, a jury found Capone guilty of income tax evasion. The judge sentenced him to 11 years in Atlanta. Capone traveled to Atlanta at night aboard the Dixie Flyer, and his train car was shunted right into the rear gate of the institution.
At that time, we had a railroad coming into the institution because we made products that required being shipped by rail. They did not want to transfer him outside of the institution to any other vehicle. So the easiest thing for them to do and the most secure thing for them to do was to simply bring him inside in the rail car.
Inside Atlanta, Capone became inmate number 40886 and lived in an 8-man cell. He was assigned to the shoe shop, where records show he worked alongside other inmates and learned to be a competent cobbler. In 1934, amid reports that he was still running the mob from inside Atlanta's walls, Capone was transferred to the Rock, the federal prison at Alcatraz. At the Rock, Capone's only visitor was his wife, May. He was not allowed to speak to anyone at the prison beside the guard staff and warden. He received no newspapers and lived alone in a 9-foot by 5-foot cell. Capone was released in 1939 amid rumors that he was suffering the dementia brought on by syphilis. He died of the disease at his home in Florida in 1947. At Atlanta, prisoners followed this news on the new wireless radio that was piped by earphones into their cells beginning in 1938. For many inmates, radio brought word of America's entry into World War II. Like all other American men, the prisoners were required to register for the draft, although they were automatically classified 4F, ineligible for service. Still, the prison began a noted war effort. Inmates produced $30 million worth of war supplies in the prison's industry building. The industry building dated from Woodrow Wilson's presidency in 1916 and was originally built to manufacture canvas bags for the U.S. Postal Service. It was under Wilson's administration that federal prisoners were first paid for their labor. From the prison's original canvas factory, inmates made tents for the troops overseas, as well as stretchers, tank covers, and water tanks used by Marines in the Pacific. By 1943, Atlanta's inmates were turning out much-needed mattresses at the rate of $10,000 per month.
They worked exceptionally hard in preparing uniforms and supplies and things like that for the troops. But they also contributed in another way, in the sense that there were a number of experiments, drug experiments that were done on the inmate population.
As an extension of the war effort, the United States Public Health Service started a study of malaria in March of 1944. The disease had become a serious problem during the war.
They were trying to find some way to treat or prevent the illness. And so they asked for volunteer inmates. They had about 200 who volunteered for the first test. And it did involve actually being bit by infected mosquitoes. And they were testing a series of different drugs that they thought would treat that.
No one died during the 18-month testing program, and none of the inmates who volunteered to be infected with malaria were compensated with any time off their sentences. Prisoners were also used for other experiments, often with little regard for their safety.
It came out during some testimony before a congressional committee that the inmates here in the 1950s were used as guinea pigs for some CIA-based drug experiments.
Foremost among the drugs was LSD, which had been discovered in 1943 and was known to produce hallucinations and symptoms of mental illness.
The doctors doing the research were doctors from Emory University. They didn't even know that the CIA was funding it. But what they were testing for was to see how a drug would affect their memory, Would it change their sex patterns? Would it create aberrant behavior?
Other medical research conducted on Atlanta's inmates included a test of how industrial noises affect hearing. Inmates were also included in a federal study of the transmission and treatment of venereal diseases. Such medical research on Atlanta's prisoners was suspended in 1976 when a federal task force found that some prisoners had been coerced into the experiments. Since then, there have been no official reports of medical testing in the prison. Atlanta Federal Penitentiary became host to many of America's convicted spies during World War II and the Cold War that followed. Among the first was Carl Friedrich Bahr. Born in Germany, Bahr was a naturalized U.S. citizen and model student. In 1942, he was arrested and charged with passing industrial secrets to the Nazis. Bahr was convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage and sentenced to 8 years at Atlanta, where he became inmate number 62387. Bahr professed his innocence during his time in prison and was paroled in 1950 with 4 years off for good behavior. In 1957, Atlanta received Soviet master spy Colonel Rudolf Abel. Convicted of conspiring to sell United States nuclear secrets to Russia, he was sentenced to 30 years. In 1962, Abel was released to the Soviet Union in exchange for Francis Gary Powers, the American U-2 spy plane pilot who was being held in a Soviet jail. Over time, Atlanta also saw its share of career criminals. Harold Thompson was sent to Atlanta in 1959.
I was sentenced to 105 years in prison for robbing banks. I robbed my first bank, and it was the toughest decision ever made in my life. But 9 months later, I'm broke. So what I did, I decided to rob another bank. Whew, what a relief when that was over. 9 months later, I'm broke again. So what did I do? I robbed another bank. And then it's just like anything else you do, it becomes a way of life.
Thompson recalls the tough transition into prison.
They shipped me to B Cell House, where I spent 3 days and nights, and I just refused to live there. It was so filthy and so crowded. So then they moved me to C Cell House, and I lived in one cell for almost 11 years.
When Thompson arrived, Atlanta was a violent institution. Inmates carried homemade knives called shanks.
Generally, inmates will attempt to manufacture weapons out of any sort of piece of metal they can get. If they can't get metal, they'll use a piece of wood to try to fashion it into some sort of a knife.
Prisoners murdered each other over possession of a towel, a toothbrush, cigarettes.
They had one guy, they called him Casper the Friendly Ghost. He would catch guys laying in their bunk and split their throat, and they never did find out who the guy was.
Thompson believes his physical size and attitude were his best defenses.
I weighed way over 300 pounds, was in good shape, liked to fight, and yeah, I had a few guys that disliked me. They'd put a shank in my back in a minute if they could. But prison's a funny thing. There's a principle that worked. Fear. If you can put the fear of God in someone, they'll stay away from you. As big as I was, no one dared jump on me because they'd seen me whip a couple guys pretty bad. And so that was pretty much the element that kept me alive.
While in prison, Thompson underwent a religious transformation and was ultimately granted clemency. He was released in 1975, and today he is an ordained minister. Thompson's prison stay took him through the 1960s, when a new wave of high-profile gangsters was sent to Atlanta. Vito Genovese was considered the boss of all bosses of the narcotics and racketeering trades in New York City. In 1959, the federal government convicted him for smuggling and distributing narcotics. After one of the most turbulent trials in history, a judge sentenced the crime overlord to federal prison for 15 years.
Vito Genovese was a gentleman. I knew a lot of these guys. I played bocce ball with them. And they were like you and I. They put their pants on one leg at a time, but they were part of something that was big.
From inside the prison, Genovese continued to rule his underworld empire and order the killing of his rivals. His cellmate for a time was Joe Valachi, another member of the New York underworld crime syndicate. Valachi was also serving time for narcotics violations. While in prison, Valachi informed government officials about Genovese's business dealings and earned for himself what gangsters call a contract.
I do know this, that a heavy contract was put out on Joe Valachi, and a reward for anybody that wanted to kill him get $100,000, so that's pretty serious business.
Valachi was transferred to Leavenworth for his own safety. In 1969, Genovese died of a heart attack at the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners, Springfield, Missouri. 1963 saw an upsurge in Atlanta's population. This was due to the government's decision to close Alcatraz. It was the end of an era, and with the removal of the final 27 inmates on March 21st, the public got its first glimpse inside America's most repressive and expensive penal institution. The most notorious of Alcatraz's inmates found themselves transferred to Atlanta. Among them was Mafia kingpin Mickey Cohen. An ex-prize fighter, Cohen had begun his career in crime as a thug for Las Vegas boss Bugsy Siegel before moving to Hollywood. Cohen inherited Siegel's racing interests and ran a bookmaking enterprise in Los Angeles. Always flamboyant, he dressed lavishly and flaunted his wealth and power. The government finally arrested Cohen and charged him with tax evasion in 1958. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison.
When they closed Alcatraz, Mickey came here, and he was a fanatic for being clean. And he'd have guys clean his cell 2 or 3 times a day. He'd use a box of talcum powder about every 2 or 3 days, and he was a character.
By the 1970s, Atlanta Federal Penitentiary was 80 years old. The modern prison authorized in 1891 was now described by officials in Washington as, quote, an obsolescent institution in which it is difficult to give offenders privacy and modern correctional programs consistent with human dignity. Those conditions contributed to an escalating wave of violence. 12 inmates and a prison dietitian were murdered in the massive penitentiary between 1973 and 1976. The prison was desperately overcrowded, and there were fears that the day might come when the staff would lose control. By 1974, penal philosophy had evolved beyond what Atlanta's physical design could offer. Prison officials preferred smaller institutions with modern security features. Such facilities allow for greater safety and manageability of the inmates. Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, with its cavernous stone cell blocks, was scheduled for closure. But in 1980, the government faced a new and growing problem. In the spring of that year, an estimated 125,000 people fled Cuba for America. They launched from the island's Mariel Harbor on countless boats and makeshift watercraft. When the so-called Mariel boat people came ashore in southern Florida, their numbers included a high percentage of criminals and those suffering from mental illness. Still others committed crimes once they arrived here. The U.S. government needed a place to incarcerate those illegal Cuban immigrants who were believed to be a threat to the public. Without trial, nearly 2,000 Marielitos were sent to Atlanta to be detained indefinitely.
Cubans were very aggressive, very unpredictable, a totally different culture. More violent prone than the average sentenced inmate in the federal system. A whole host of psychotic inmates. At one time, our count here of Cubans only was about 1,850. 415 of those were psychotic inmates.
Sam Ivanovich was a guard at Atlanta when the Cubans came.
In this one cell house, there are probably close to 500 Cubans, okay? And one of them had a comb, and it was stolen from his belongings, in the cell. And the same inmate that had the comb stolen stabbed another Cuban about 5 or 6 times and killed him. And when asked, whatever did you do that for? And he said, he stole my comb.
One inmate wanted another's watch, and they got in a fight over that, and it escalated, and it began to grow, and our staff were in jeopardy.
Atlanta became a pressure cooker packed with violent and aggressive prisoners. Its heating, lighting, and water systems had become deficient due to age and vandalism caused by the inmates. On November 23, 1987, the crisis reached a boiling point.
They were desperate, and so when desperate people find no way out and feel they lose hope, they do irrational things, and that was an irrational situation that became mob action.
For 8 hours, the Cuban inmates rampaged, turning Atlanta Federal Penitentiary into a riotous scene of fire, screaming, and destruction. Hostages were taken, and guards fired tear gas into the confusion as they fought to regain control. FBI agents were called in equipped with riot gear to assist prison and local authorities. And using helicopters, firefighters dropped water onto the flames in an effort to stop the destruction. When the siege was over, one inmate was dead, but surprisingly, there were no other serious injuries. Inside the walls, buildings were blackened and beds were twisted. Since that time, Atlanta Federal Penitentiary has undergone extensive renovation, and the Bureau of Prisons now plans to keep the institution open. Modern cell blocks have been added to house high-security inmates in a subdued and antiseptic environment. Prisoners in the newest building live in single cells that are observed around the clock. No movements go undetected. There is little room for violent behavior or unauthorized activity. State-of-the-art security and communication equipment has been installed along with new ventilation and plumbing systems. Outside, razor wire now trims the monumental stone facade where a prisoner once climbed out a window in a failed escape attempt.
If you cut it, it moves a lot, okay? And the more you cut it, the more it's going to move. So if you get involved with razor wire and you try to cut yourself out, you're going to cut all the pieces. You'll bleed to death because the more you move and the more you cut, the worse it gets.
Guard towers are air-conditioned and equipped with high-powered automatic weapons and night vision surveillance equipment. In some ways, though, the federal penitentiary in Atlanta continues to operate as it did in 1903. It still incarcerates America's most notorious federal criminals, and it persists in keeping the outside world from seeing in. much of what goes on behind the walls today remains a mystery.
We wouldn't restrict you from filming because of real danger. We have security concerns that we don't do a lot of filming inside the institution. We will take you in and show you what a current modern-day cell house looks like.
The modern cell block was the only area our camera crew was allowed to photograph. The rest of the institution remains unseen. Its daily routine known only through official reports. Even those are punctuated by accusations of inmate mistreatment and torture. The murder of one of Atlanta's prison guards was among the most recent tragedies to focus attention here.
In 1994, Correctional Officer DeAntonio Washington was killed by an inmate here. And he was hit from behind by an inmate who had gotten a hammer from another inmate on a work detail and came up behind him and struck him with a hammer.
The prisoners were locked in their cells, and the inmate who killed Officer Washington was quickly apprehended. There was a period of mourning, the cell doors were reopened, and life went on at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary.
This is a dangerous place, and it has been for much of its history, and it's dangerous primarily because of the kind of inmates that it keeps here. When it first opened, it was open for maximum security inmates, and there have only been brief periods during its history when any other type of inmate was kept here.
The future is not entirely clear. America's federal prison system is running at full capacity, and renovations continue to be made at Atlanta. For better or for worse, the staff and inmates here expect the Big A to be open long after its centennial in the year 2002.